It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. And we're on the line this morning with Michael Hiltzik. Our conversation brought to you by Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people. And Michael was the author of Iron Empires, Robber Barons, Railroads, and the Making of Modern America. And it's good to have you with us. Michael, good morning.
Good morning.
It is so wonderful to have you with us, and this book is so richly detailed. It's an age that I know that a lot of people wonder how the railroad system got built across America, and as you detail for us, it was not only fits and starts. For a lot of people, it wasn't even starts, was it?
That's right. There was a lot of chicanery going on that involved not actually building railroads, but selling railroad securities, and so there were a lot of phantom railroads, there were a lot of unnecessary railroads, and somehow over time we got the network that we've got today.
And you,
in fact, a bigger network than we have today.
You introduce us in this book to those men, for the most part, who made this all happen in America, and some of them are not the most savory characters we've ever met, and we begin to see this newborn railroad industry come to shape with the ascendancy of guys like J. Pierpont Morgan. Vanderbilt, of course, is another name that we are quite familiar with, and Averell Harriman, and we're going to focus upon those gentlemen in just a couple of moments. But, you know, as we watch this industry being born, we begin to get an understanding of the different challenges of building a railroad across America and then building a railroad network. And those are two different things, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, in the very early stages, what we had was a series of railroads, or a number of self-contained railroads that didn't really network with each other. They had different track gauges, that is the distance between the rails on either side. They had different schedules. They couldn't coordinate, and it wasn't unusual for travelers who were trying to get long distances, not just across the continent, to be becalmed and left alone at depots for hours or even days because they had to wait for the next railroad to send its trains, or for the trains to come through. In fact, J.P. Morgan, on his very first trip on the Transcontinental Railroad, his group got becalmed for hours and hours outside of Omaha because they were waiting for the Union Pacific to show up.
Introduce us to a couple of the people who become real principals in this. First of all, I want to talk about Jay Cooke. Jay Cooke almost brought the whole country down, didn't he?
Well, he did, but first he pretty much built the country up. Jay Cooke was in the 1870s the most famous financier in America, the most famous banker, and that was because he had helped to finance the Union effort in the Civil War. He was a master at selling government bonds, and the government basically hired him or commissioned him to sell a lot of major bond issues so that the Union would have the money to fight the war. So he came out of the war really riding high, and then he got involved in the Northern Pacific, which was a proposal to build a second transcontinental railroad to go along with the Union Pacific, Central Pacific, and that really brought him down. So in 1873, when it emerged that the Northern Pacific was in deep financial trouble and that Jay Cooke's entire fortune was wrapped up in it, Cooke and Company failed, and then a number of other brokerages and banks failed, and we got the Panic of 1873, which led to a long depression that until the 1930s was what Americans referred to when they talked about the Great Depression. It was 6 brutal years of an economic downturn, and it really was caused by the railroads in general and the Northern Pacific and Cooke specifically.
And it came on the heels of the Credit Mobilier scandal, which really pointed to the fact that until a guy like J.P. Morgan comes along, the railroad industry is looked at as simply a money-making scheme by the people who are making that money, and no one really was making an effort to build a viable, long-term actual industry until Morgan came along.
Now, these financiers and the backers of the railroad industry were really much more interested in, as you said, making money from trading railroad securities back and forth. So an enormous amount of money went astray. You had inflated stocks and bonds, watered stocks and bonds, as they called them at the time, and precious few miles were being built, or at least not as many miles as was claimed.
Yeah. So Morgan comes along, and all of a sudden it becomes a business that is actually established more as an actual railroad business. You know, here in Western Pennsylvania, the railroad industry is so important. My granddad spent his entire life working for the Pennsylvania Railroad. I think a lot of people might lose the fact that without the railroad industry, America doesn't become what America became, does it?
That's true. The way I've described it is that the railroads were America's first big business. They were to Americans at the time what investment banks and what high tech is today. They were the biggest employers. They collected the most money. They spent the most money, and they were so big that in fact they changed methods of business management pretty much for the better. Before the railroads came along, before this great growth in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the biggest American businesses were pretty small. They were self-contained. You might be talking about a textile company with a couple of plants all in one region, let's say New England. The railroad industry was very different and changed all that, and all of a sudden you had employment that was 10 or even 100 times larger than the largest businesses up to then, and of course it was a much more complex management challenge than anything that had come before, and management technique really evolved to match it.
Your book allows us to actually watch J.P. Morgan and E.H. Harriman, especially E.H. Harriman, grow into becoming the railroad tycoons that they became. Even they sort of took a while to get a handle on the potential for railroad, but then on what it took to make that happen.
That's right. As we got to the last decades of the 19th century, it became clear that the way the railroad industry had developed, that is, with a lot of competing small railroads that were building lines basically to challenge each other, to undercut each other, that was not sustainable. That was wasting an enormous amount of money. It was not creating a good, consistent industry. So there was a lot of sentiment that what the railroad industry needed was a Bismarck, and that's because Otto von Bismarck at that time had brought together these little German duchies into what became modern Germany. So the railroad industry was looking for a Bismarck, and it was Morgan, because he already had all sorts of financial connections, and he had respectability, and he had ability. He was seen as the man to do it, and he did start that process.
We're talking with Michael Hiltzik, who is the author of Iron Empires, Robber Barons, Railroads, and the Making of Modern America. I don't know, how long did it take you to put all of this together? The research must have just been incredibly difficult.
Well, it wasn't difficult, though it was involved. There were a lot of archives around the country that had a lot of documents, a lot of remembrances and reminiscences. One curious thing is that there was very little really accessible about E.H. Harriman. For some reason, Harriman never wrote his own memoirs. Some of his associates wrote about him, including John Muir, the great naturalist who became a friend of Harriman's for reasons we can talk about. So it was a real challenge to find material about him, but there was a lot of material about all the other characters, Vanderbilt, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, these two scoundrels around the time of the Civil War, and of course J.P. Morgan. So the whole process took maybe 4 years, luckily, I write fast, so most of that time was spent researching, and then maybe 10 or 12 months writing.
Well, you write fast, you write well as well, and
Thanks.
it's a story that just carries us along. That relationship between Muir and Harriman it's a fascinating one, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it grew from one of the most extraordinary efforts made by any American industrialist really in history, and that was a 2-month expedition, scientific expedition, that Harriman sponsored and went on himself to Alaska. Alaska at the time was still a very, very remote place. It had not been widely explored. It had been explored once or twice by Muir himself, but he didn't get very far. So Harriman put together essentially a team of hundreds of scientists. He paid for their way. He went along on the expedition, and the result was 8 volumes of important scientific findings, drawings, observations that are still mined by experts to this day, and they're all at the Smithsonian.
It is available as an ebook and also as an audiobook from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Where can people learn more about the book and about what you are all about and what you're working on?
Well, they can go to my personal website, and that's michaelhiltzik.com. One word, Michael Hiltzik. It's Hilt for Thomas, Z for Zebra, IK, and that's got access to booksellers who are selling Iron Empires, as well as my 6 other books. So people can go there and they can find something about every book, as well as buttons that they can press to go to booksellers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and local sellers as well.
It's beautiful, beautiful. What are you working on now? Have you got something in the pipeline?
I do. My next book, it's already been commissioned, and the work has already started, or my work has already started. And that's going to be a history of California.
Oh, okay. Well, what have they done? Well, that's where you live, and it's so good to talk with you today all the way across the country here in Pennsylvania. Thanks for being with us today.
Happy to join you.